Hi, good afternoon. And thanks to Robert, Catherine, and Daphne for organizing such a great event. And thanks to Sue for basically encapsulating really effectively the complexity of this problem. And I think one of the big realizations that we need to come to is that beyond the direct impacts on species, which are immense, we're talking about transnational or organized scope, basically, to this problem. So the poachers that we're concerned with are often linked to these international crime organizations. They take advantage of weak laws and enforcement, porous borders, and corrupt officials. And so as important as it is to have a really strong policy framework in place, if we don't have good enforcement, then we're not going to solve the problem. These international networks are often very violent, sophisticated, and they finance activities related to terrorism and other types of crime. So poaching and the illegal trade of wildlife is not just a threat to species, as I've said, but it's a threat to national security and has ecological consequences and really threatens to undermine our conservation and development gains that we've made over the last decades. This session on transnational organized crime and law enforcement implications for governance and security, I think we've assembled a panel that represents in some ways the partnership the types of partnerships that are needed to really address these things effectively. So we have a representative from Fish and Wildlife Service, from U.S. Agency for International Development, and Traffic, an NGO. And so we're starting to get to a point where we're recognizing how critical conservation is to development, and also the way that these different agencies need to work together to address all these different aspects of the problem. So with that, I'd like to invite Crawford Allan, who's the Senior Director of Traffic. He's had 24 years of experience in wildlife conservation, working on issues related to trafficking, but I think almost more importantly also experience building the kind of collaborations and networks that we're going to need to solve these issues. So Crawford, welcome.
Okay, well, thank you, Nathan, and thank you, AAAS. Before I start, I did just want to mention the two discussants that are about to follow me, because actually, you know, when people complain about federal government, they have good reasons sometimes, but in this case, they really don't, because these guys have done an amazing work for decades. They're not old, but they've been working for decades on these issues, and they have, you know, I'm very honored to be on the same stage as them. I'll just leave it at that. So we're going to talk about this particular issue that I think there's been a lot of debate about. There's a lot of debate and dialogue. First thing, I'll just give a quick background to Traffic so you know who you're dealing with. Traffic has the good fortune of having two uber parent organizations of IUCN and the World Wildlife Fund. And Traffic was set up nearly 40 years ago to look specifically at the wildlife trade. And obviously the illegal elements of that are something that we've worked on for a long time in monitoring. And I think science, we'd like to think, is at the heart of what we do in terms of our research work in informing and assisting governments, particularly in this area. So I love this topic that Marshall Jones of Smithsonian mentioned and debated with Sue just now about the value of illegal wildlife trade, because you have to ask yourself, where do these figures come from? What do they really mean? How can you evaluate something that is covert by its very nature, and whereby you have sophisticated, as you've heard, criminal networks going to great lengths to cover their tracks? I think, for me, it's quite important to understand that actually we need a figure. Whether that figure's right or wrong, whether it's 10 billion, 20 billion, 30 billion, maybe that doesn't really matter. Maybe we just need leadership and policymakers to have a figure to use as leverage to make people understand the economic implications of this problem. We need to understand the multiple facets of the issue and why it is undermining governance and why it is a security issue, and many of these other issues we're going to hear about today. When you hear that that illegal wildlife trade is the fifth most lucrative crime internationally compared to these others, you start wondering, and people on the street, if you like, who don't really know would say, is that right? Is that true? I think where it sits, whether it's 5 or 10, again, it's the same thing. I think we need to understand, though, and we need to use the information to the best of our possible means to leverage change and political will. Because when you see and hear of so many amazing animals being slaughtered almost to the point of extinction, Let's not fight amongst ourselves about whether it's 5 million here or there difference. Let's make sure we get solutions and results. So the killing by the numbers, again, you look at the economic value of the impact of this trade. Everyone understands the economics, but also you need to look at the scale of the biological impact, the ecological impact. And also these figures, they tug on the heartstrings. This is incredibly emotional. I won't be showing necessarily these gruesome pictures of what goes on and the 300 elephants killed in one park in Cameroon in a few weeks. But, you know, it is absolutely devastating for people, and it is something that will really help us mobilize and make a difference. I think you can see that rhinos really are at a tipping point now. And from the success of their recovery, that is unraveling very rapidly, and solutions are dramatically needed. And you can see that, you know, with the elephants, where you hear about 100,000 being lost within a 3-year period in Africa, and you start thinking, well, I know the scientists are debating over how many elephants are in Africa. Is it 400,000? Is it 500? Is it 600? But really, when you hear 100,000, that doesn't matter if it's a quarter or a fifth or a sixth of the population. That is just a very, very terrible and devastating impact. And of course, we think about tigers. I'll throw in there a little bit of hope there, because we could get depressed quite easily, and we don't want that, right? We will be passing out happy pills in the reception afterwards. But, you know, there is some strong signs that tigers are coming roaring back, and that is something we must hold on to, and we must understand, why is that the case? What is the secret sauce? What's that recipe that made it happen? I won't go on about sharks and pangolins, but let's not forget there are other critters out there that really need support and help too. And if we're thinking about this from a sort of biological and a species-centric focus. We also need bad guys. We need an enemy to fight, and we need to put a face on that enemy if we wanted to get some rallying cry behind how do we improve our judicial system, how do we make sure that the bad guys are caught and jailed and put away appropriately. You may be aware of this guy, Chumlong Lemok Thai, South African criminal, based in South Africa, but a Thai national, part of the famous Laotian gang that the State Department put out $1 million award on for dismantling that gang. This is his nice Facebook photo, quite a good one. But I'm sure he didn't have any friends. But I just want to say that, you know, we also need to understand that. We need to get to those criminal nexus. We don't, and I think Sue was very right, this isn't about poverty anymore. This isn't just about poor Africans eking out a living. This is about guys like this, based in Africa, smuggling women for the sex trade and smuggling rhino horn for big, big money. I also wanted to talk about what we call a mini-fauna, not a megafauna, charismatic mini-fauna, abalone. This is really interesting because this just shows how the connectivity between organized crime and wildlife really is just going hand in hand. It shows very much the involvement of serious organized crime. We're talking about machine gun fights on the beach in southern Africa over abalone. We're talking about exchanging abalone for drugs as the payment. It's not cash, it's a barter system with drugs. And this graph just represents some of the transition from a legal trade over to an illegal trade. And quite an interesting dynamic here on the intelligence side that needs to be woven into our solutions is to really understand and map out who are the players, how do they operate, how do they exchange information. You need intelligence, you need information and modeling that informs policies. Unless you understand who are the people, how are they working, any policy you put in place will be flawed. I also want to mention the private sector. We're talking about governance and security, and we're thinking about boots on the ground, and we're thinking about terrorist groups. Let's not forget that the private sector actually has got a critical role here, and private sector must engage more with law enforcement. It's a difficult interface because they're worried about punitive measures against themselves, but there are great ways in which we can get involved. And in this case, the example is transport. It shows you how complicated it is. But when you sit down, as I did recently at a USAID workshop in Bangkok with the transport sector looking at wildlife trafficking, you sit there and you hear from the transport sector itself a great willingness to help, and actually a great level of information that they hold that is totally untapped by law enforcement and by those people that are directing resources at certain parts of the trade chain. So you need to get them involved and get them certainly giving you information. When you have somebody that you meet from Kenyan Airways, as I did, who says, what's all this lion bone stuff coming through from Southern Africa, going to this guy in Laos, and then you look at the details and you find out it's the same guy with $1 million bounty on his head. And this is information that's sitting out there untapped. And when you think about the sort of the trafficking piece, you think of these images, you think about strong law enforcement, you see tusks being seized, just like the 7 tons seized last week in Thailand. And you think about perhaps poached animals. But I think, also you have to think about the human impact in all of this and bear that in mind and make those linkages when we're trying to encourage change about the fact that those ivory tusks sitting there in Thailand, how many lives were lost, not in terms of the elephants, but also the people that were protecting them as well. This comes on to one of my favorite subjects, one that I've been asked about many, many times. And I'm no expert, I'm no CIA intelligence official, but the intelligence agencies are getting involved. They are looking at this issue. And you'll hear all the time, I've sat in, I don't know how many meetings where somebody like Hillary Clinton has been standing at the podium and has said, this is the Janjaweed, this is Al-Shabaab, this is the LRA. And I think to myself, okay, so she's, obviously at that time she was a Secretary of State or not, later, so she must know that's right. Well, I wonder, really, how much of this really can be seen as saber rattling and how much of this is true? How much really are the terrorist groups involved with the poaching of animals like elephants, and how much of the financial flows going to them? I would say there is definite truth in this. There's definite involvement. But is it all of these groups? Probably not. Boko Haram probably are not involved. Al-Shabaab, it's when people make connections to the slaughter of people in the Kenyan Westgate Mall, as in this image here, showing people running from the Westgate Mall. Were they really funded by elephant ivory trade? I'm not so sure. The LRA, I think, yes, that's rock solid. I think everyone knows that they're involved in poaching of elephants and that they're making money out of ivory trafficking. That's pretty clear. But with some of these others, the Janjaweed, I think they're very clearly shown to be moving cross-country and moving into countries like Cameroon in the past and poaching lots of elephants. But really, let's be careful about this. Let's not just run to some very simple and quick and easy solutions and start crying wolf where that may not be there as well, because that way you can certainly stop losing influence. And let's make sure that the data is very solid before we start formulating solutions to say go after Boko Haram for ivory trafficking when there's no truth in that. And of course, that brings me to the next element in all of this, and that is the element of the communities and the people, like these people in Namibia, that are starting to see rhino poaching occurring after just not having that problem at all, and how that's going to affect them in the future. And let's think about the communities involved in all of this. And when we talk about enforcement and governance that I'm supposed to be talking about, I can't help talk about the communities. I can't help say law enforcement has to work better with the communities. Law enforcement has to go, again, the word hand in hand with the communities. It's a scary thing for people to work with law enforcement. But they are the eyes and ears for law enforcement. If you get the right people together, understanding the value of nature and the protection of nature and what it will mean to them for their future livelihoods and benefits, and give them some ownership, you'll see solutions, and you'll see them becoming the guardians of that wildlife and working with law enforcement. I want to talk a little bit about a a case study. I'll try and zip through. But when we talk about the transnational organized crime, this is a graph showing the volumes of ivory seized around the world and the number of shipments of those ivory. And if you look at 2014, the data's not quite complete, but about 60 tons of elephant ivory and only a few hundred shipments. It's starting to show very large shipments of ivory, very well coordinated. Clearly, only this sort of stuff can happen with very well organized criminal networks. If you look back in history between 2000 and 2008, the flows of ivory were quite there were multiple strands. There was a lot of ivory going out of South Africa via Singapore to Japan, and Japan was the major consumer market showing up in the seizures data. It was all over the map, if you like, at that point. And then you started to see some movement out of East Africa. East Africa became the stronghold and the movement. You started to see Middle East showing up as a transit point. And this is where China starts to come in around this time in 2009 as the main consumer market. And you see that it's not just about the consumer market shifting, it's also about where law enforcement's improving as well. And where law enforcement improves, they start moving their shipments. And in fact, by 2012, look how brave they've got. They start smuggling big shipments via Europe even, and actually using some of their traditional drug smuggling routes to also smuggle ivory. You may have seen this image before. This is a semi-trailer, an X-ray in Hong Kong port, 40-foot sea container filled with plywood, and a strange black blob over there in the corner, which when they took out all the plywood and they ran it through the X-ray and it was an empty container, that big black blob was still there. So the cutting torches were applied. They cut open the fake back wall in Hong Kong in 2006, and they found the ivory that you are familiar with, over 4 tons of elephant ivory. And when they looked at the manifest, they saw that the same company in Cameroon was exporting 16 times in the previous 2 years to the same company in Hong Kong. And they raided the compound in Cameroon, and they found several sea containers with false walls. And it shows a very highly organized transnational operation between Africa and Asia. If you look at the case of rhinos, I think you're familiar with this image. You've seen this graph before. This is the state of poaching of rhinos in South Africa. And you know the figures. You know that 1,215 rhinos were killed last year in South Africa alone. And you've got to say to yourself, South Africa's quite a sophisticated country. They're getting all this money to help them with law enforcement. They're pretty good at this stuff. Why is this poaching going on? And I would draw your attention back to Sue's earlier point about corruption. I would say that if they tackled the corruption issue, that column on the right at 1,200 would probably be half by now. And I would say that fundamentally the reason for this challenge and crisis is purely corrupt practice. The nature of the trafficking, the value of the product. If you could sell a rhino horn for $500,000, imagine what that would mean to you if you were a ranger in Africa or a veterinarian protecting rhinos. I would say that the issue of rhinos here isn't necessarily more boots on the ground. It's about getting to those people that are involved in the criminal networks who are corrupt, who are targeting the activity. This graph you may not have seen. This is just to show you the poaching of rhinos in Africa as a whole with many countries. And you'll see it sort of emulates that South African issue as most of the poaching is taking place. But we estimate that over 2,200 rhino horns last year alone entered the illegal trade from Africa. That's the largest we've ever been able to calculate. And the amount of money that must mean is something that I really wouldn't even want to mention, probably because of what it would mean. But when it comes to this is also another thing about mapping out the criminal networks involved and how it works. This is something that the South Africans have done. You can see this graphic. This is where they've worked out how it all works. We need to figure out at what point in these levels of organized crime do you really need to put the most effort to try and make the most, to do the best line of attack, if you like. And the constant attack of trying to detect poachers on the ground is very highly intensive. And if you look at this graphic as well, this actually shows that the big green area at the bottom is the number of poachers arrested, and the black is those people who are the middlemen, and the grey being the couriers, and at the very top it's the exporters. And also you need to shift that dynamic away from it being the poachers that you're addressing, and you need to get further up the chain to have a much longer lasting and sustainable attack. And that means all sorts of things that we're going to hear about today, like intelligence-led approaches, along the trade chain, like international cooperation, like joint operations. We're looking at solutions, we're looking at policies. Well, I wanted to mention a pretty heavy-handed policy by that US government we talked about earlier, Craig Hoover, that in fact, if you look at this, if you look at the graph again, this is a graph about illegal rhino horn trade and poaching again. And if you look at this period here, between 1994 and 2007, there was almost no rhino poaching in Africa. And those Americans put in place in 1993 the threat of Pele sanctions against 3 of the critical rhino horn consumers, and Taiwan was sanctioned for that. And you saw a dramatic decrease in the rhino horn trade as a direct result of that activity. And of course, that is due credit to the US for all my joking, but you have to ask yourself, how would those same sorts of sanctions, if applied, really resonate today when some of the key markets are countries like Vietnam and maybe to a degree China? I think that the sanction issue is one that people don't like to use, but let's think about it, and let's think about that as a policy context about the pros and cons of that. It is quite difficult, I realize. And yes, I do have to raise my hat and tip my glass to the US government as well, particularly Fish and Wildlife Service for Operation Crash. You may have heard this. Let's not forget that this is in our own backyard too. And there has been some incredibly complicated investigations into some incredibly complicated crime networks here that has reaped dozens and dozens of rhino horn and millions of dollars. And it is phenomenal to see how it works. And let's not just forget that back in the US as well. So this brings me on to this issue of destructions. We've talked about this. I call it the crush and burn. Let's think about understanding these destructions and what message it sends to the market, what message it sends to criminal networks. When we talk about these incredibly rare resources that are dwindling to the point of extinction, to anybody who wants to think about making money, they want to try to stockpile and collect basically resources that are going to be scarce in future. And you could imagine that sending messages out that we're destroying lots of stocks, there's fewer and fewer elephants and there's fewer and fewer stocks of ivory, may in fact also send a message to the market. That means this commodity price is going to increase. That means we need to stockpile it. And actually, in criminal network terms, they're banking on this. They're literally speculating on extinction and stockpiling for the day when that last rhino is killed so that they can make a killing. So I think the answer to this is not one that burns and crushes are wrong, but let's understand what they achieve and let's understand what impact they have. And this is where all you scientists in the audience come in. I would like you all, if you could, if you have any skills in this, to try to figure out ways we can understand what messages this is giving to the market, to the economics and to the criminal networks. And this is the photo that my mum loves, if you like to say, back in jolly old England. And yes, that tall, handsome guy is Christian Samper of WCS. But you know, this is, I think, was a critical turning point in this issue, in sort of understanding the links to security and the governance problems. And this was in 2012 when then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had a call to action. And then she called upon the intelligence services to look at gathering intelligence information about the whole criminal nexus in Africa. And a whole series of things and a slew of initiatives arose, I think, out of this major activity and this major champion. And let's not forget champions. If you're developing policy, you need to give the leadership the tools they need to become champions and to look good. Let's face it, politicians need to look good. And policymakers need to provide them with the ammunition to do this for us. And I just wanted to say that I think when you're looking at the future, I think you can't go wrong with looking at the framework the US has developed. Admittedly, it needs some very strong tailoring if we were to apply the same US strategy in other countries internationally, but I think we should look at that. I think the US strategy provides a very strong framework and implementation plan. It kind of covers all the bases, if you like, and I'm hoping that our discussants will explain a little bit about that and how it can be used to help implement solutions on the ground in future. And finally, you jolly scientists, if you do have any out there, I would just like to say that I'm all with you on this. I think science has to inform decision making. We need to understand and map out these networks. We need to understand the drivers and motivators. We need to have sophisticated systems, and I think big data can help us in that. Even little data can help, but big data as well. And let's think about how we can start to work together to gather that information. Let's not sit on our data. Let's think about ways we can safely share information to try and find some of the connections and some of the ways we can take down these criminal networks that are involved. And so I flag a number of organizations here that I've certainly worked with and would recommend, but we have to work in close partnership. We have to think about how we can leverage each other's resources, because only together are we going to lick this problem, if you'll excuse the pun. That is one of my favorite photos. But I do think that you have to also think about The success of the tiger. The tiger is coming back. There is solutions there. This is not hopeless. Let's go into our reception with a smile on our face this evening after hearing about some of these challenges and understand that science and policy really can play a critical role, but only in partnership will we working together make that happen. Thank you.
Is there another presentation? Thank you, Crawford. Now I'd like to welcome Craig Hoover, who is the Chief of the Wildlife Trade and Conservation Branch of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Following Sue and Crawford is always a bit of a challenge, so my intention was to just stand up here and say yes what they said. But I was instructed I wouldn't be given drink tickets for the reception, and I was very disappointed. So I'll use my 10 minutes to talk through some of the things that particularly the Fish and Wildlife Service is doing to combat wildlife trafficking under the auspices of the national strategy and the implementation plan. And you've seen a number of these facts and figures already, but of course it's difficult to overstate the impact that trafficking is having on many species and communities that rely on them. 90% of elephants lost in certain countries over the past decade, 65% of forest elephants in a decade, 100,000 elephants during 2010 through 2012. And as we've already heard discussed, massive increase in illegal ivory trade, dozens of seizures exceeding 500 kilograms each, ivory exceeding $1,000 per pound in certain markets. 19 countries that have specifically been called out by CITES as primary, secondary, or importance to watch countries as either ivory suppliers, transit countries, or consumer countries, and asked to develop national ivory action plans or face the potential for trade suspensions. Likewise, African rhino poaching has surged dramatically, as we heard and saw in Crawford's slides. Only 13,000 rhinos poached in South Africa in 2007, to 1,004 in 2013, and 1,215 in 2014. But it's not really just about elephants and rhinos. They are certainly the poster children for the challenge we face with regard to combating wildlife trafficking. But it's also about pangolins, which are, I believe, the most heavily illegally traded mammal group in the world. It's about turtles, freshwater turtles and tortoises. It's about snakes. It's about a species of endangered fish found in the Sea of Cortez called the totoaba, which is exploited for its swim bladder, which is in demand, particularly in China. And the unfortunate side effect of that illegal trade is it is also driving the endangered vaquita porpoise to extinction, a population that is perhaps under 50 specimens left in the world. It's not just about wildlife, it's about plants, it's about big leaf mahogany, it's about rosewood, it's about orchids, it's about cacti. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of species being pushed toward extinction due to illegal take and illegal trade. And of course, it's not just about the natural resource, it's about the human cost as well. It's about the thousands of park rangers that have been wounded or killed over the past few decades while trying to protect these populations. It's park rangers that are under-equipped and literally outgunned by organized criminal groups. It's about the local communities that are robbed of their valuable natural resources. It's about creating instability and undermining governance. And the profits from poaching support insurgent groups, as we heard Crawford describe, if they foster corruption and they destabilize governments. And you don't need to hear it from me, you can hear it from the Director of National Intelligence, who told Congress earlier this year that illicit trade in wildlife, timber, and marine resources endanger the environment, They threaten the rule of law and border security in fragile regions, and they destabilize communities that depend on wildlife for biodiversity and for ecotourism. So as you've already heard briefly, President Obama signed an executive order on July 1st, 2013, and that executive order on wildlife trafficking established a presidential task force, and it created an 8-member advisory council to advise that task force. The task force is co-chaired by the Departments of Interior, State, and Justice. The task force was tasked with creating a national strategy, which was released in February of last year, and then earlier this year, we released an implementation plan for that strategy. And the executive order leverages and enhances government agency collaboration, and it focuses on really 3 areas of intervention: strengthening enforcement and prosecution, reducing demand for illegally traded wildlife, and expanding international cooperation and commitment. And as I said, these are further detailed in the implementation plan released in February. So I want to talk a little bit specifically about what the Fish and Wildlife Service is doing under the auspices of the national strategy. And particularly, given the subject matter for this particular panel, focusing on the enforcement aspects of our efforts, and really just some of the highlights. One is we're pursuing, through a series of administrative actions, a near total ban on elephant ivory trade here in the United States. That includes imports to the United States, exports from, and trade within the United States. We're also working with Congress to extend money laundering and racketeering statutes to criminal violations of certain wildlife laws, which is laid out in S-27, introduced by Senators Feinstein and Graham. And we're also supporting on-the-ground efforts to protect species and habitats, strengthen enforcement, and reduce demand. We're doing that through our grants programs. We're doing that through our Office of Law Enforcement, building capacity around the world. We are, for the first time, stationing our wildlife law enforcement attachés around the world. We have 5 positions. We have already stationed someone in Thailand. We are currently in the process of putting someone in Tanzania, someone in Botswana, someone in Peru, and in the near future, someone in China. And these positions are meant to lend expertise, facilitate information exchange, and build capacity. We believe that our wildlife law enforcement personnel are the greatest in the world, and it's time for us to take those resources and spread that expertise around the world, build the capacity of wildlife enforcement experts in other countries. So here's the solution. See, it only took 1 slide. We need to treat wildlife crime as serious crime. We need a whole-of-government approach, bringing all relevant tools to bear. We need international cooperation. We need to work together, law enforcement, conservation, and diplomatic counterparts around the world. We need to address all parts of the trade chain, from protecting wildlife populations on the ground to changing consumer behavior. And at the end of the day, we need to incentivize doing the right thing. We need to make it easier for governments, easier for protected area managers, easier for those who might engage in poaching, those who might engage in illegal trade, easier for all of them to do the right thing by wildlife than to do the wrong thing. You may have seen this in the Washington Post just this past weekend. This is not the end we seek, but without a concerted global effort, working in cooperation across the entire trade chain, this is the end we might get. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Craig. Now finally, please welcome Mary Rowan, who is a Senior Biodiversity Policy Advisor in the Bureau for Economic Growth, Education, and the Environment at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Mary.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I've spent a lot of time in this building as a former fellow, so it's great to be part of this symposium. And that, I have to say, my previous speakers, that you're a hard act to follow. I will try and add a few points, but a lot of what I was going to say has been said, and I want to reflect really my points, coming from Agency for International Development, we're a development agency. Conservation is development, but I want to dive into some of the aspects that relate to some of the work we do with communities and along the enforcement chain. First of all, I've seen many of you all over Washington in conversations on wildlife trafficking, and that's critical. We're at a crisis stage right now, but we have to remember that there are other aspects, as Sue mentioned, to biodiversity loss, and we can't lose the focus on them at the same time as we're dealing with the wildlife crisis. The wildlife crisis, wildlife trafficking, is unique because it really affects, rangers are being killed, as other speakers have said, and they're outgunned, they're outmaneuvered, and a lot of what we need to do is build that capacity, protect them, and to be able to do their work. And also, a lot of it is rangers are catching poachers, but we need to work along that enforcement chain to make sure that the chain of evidence and the prosecutions work, so their efforts are taken and are brought to fruition. Rural communities have the most to lose and little to gain. If you look at the conservation community after the last 20 years, what have we really focused on? It's been landscape level conservation. That's brought communities into the conservation point. And here you have a poaching crisis that's taking their economic development away. It's also taking away the economic development of countries. If you look at tourism as such a huge wage earner and income generator, really we need the ministries of finance to really understand the scale of this problem to their country's outlook. And the profits finance other criminal activities, whether it's terrorism or organized crime. The profits from this don't go back into the governments. They don't go to the communities. They go to people who use them for other illicit activities. And so it's something that affects a whole range of economic drivers and security across a country. This graph has been seen. I just want to put it in to show the interconnectedness of this work. I mean, of this problem. It goes transcontinental. If you had a graph of pet trafficking, you'd have a lot of arrows going to the US and to Europe. It is a global issue. I'll skip some of these because Crawford's touched on them. But just one thing on the Abalone Trade, and Crawford mentioned that some of the poachers are being paid in methamphetamines. The connections to the drug trade are huge, but it's also moving through different countries. A lot of the abalone is going from South Africa through Zambia, which does not have a coastline, and sent over to Southeast Asia. So it's bringing a lot of different players into that enforcement or that trafficking chain. And the thing about all of this is a graphic that Crawford had up, but if you look at the divers are paying for the spotters, the crew, the various groups. These are the groups that are getting arrested. If you look at the outside syndicates, they're not the ones that are getting the big crime arrests. It's really the little guys. And the same thing, if you look at the same graphic with the rhino horn trade, look at that lower level. You have level 1, 2, 3. Level 1 is the poachers and individuals, then the poaching groups. Then 3 is just the national level. It doesn't even, and then if you look at this, where are the arrests? Where are the prosecutions? They're really at the poaching level. Unfortunately, with the demands let me put it this way. With the profits so high and the potential for payoff is so low, we're not going to run out of young or middle-aged rural communities wanting to make a profit, or individuals. That we are never going to run out of this blue sphere, this blue color group of people. There are always going to be more people who are going to try and make a profit even if there's high risk, because the potential for reward is so great. So really what other speakers have mentioned is we really need to focus up that enforcement chain. Yes, the second level, the collectors of the products, but it's the exporters and at the delivery countries really looking at trying to get those organized crime lords. So there are a lot of things that need to be done, and a a lot of what has been spoken about addresses many of these points. I want to touch on a little bit more detail on the community wildlife management and the private sector. Community conservation, as Sue and Crawford and others have discussed, is a very successful conservation tool. It's been very successful in landscape conservation, and communities are involved for a variety of different reasons. In Namibia, you find the conservancy movement. Communities are making money from both photographic and trophy tourism. And if you talk to some of the community members, some of the big benefits they get are, yes, there's the job creation, but it's also the meat from the trophy industry. And that's a critical aspect. If you talk to some communities in northern Kenya, where I had the fortune to work for quite a number of years, the benefits are different. A lot of the benefits from community conservation are improved grazing land for their livestock. But I was talking to a conservancy probably 10 years ago now, and some of the young men were talking about they had jobs, they had stature as community rangers. Their wives were making money off of handicrafts. There was great economic benefit. There were things going to the community schools. But one man who really didn't have anything positive to say about wildlife, didn't have anything negative, he mentioned the first time in his life he could sleep through the night. And that was because he didn't have to worry about cattle raiding. So it was personal security and security for his livestock that really made it important for him why he was interested in this. And a lot of this goes to an increasing, I would say, cooperation between community scouts, protected area authorities, and police, and where those can be linked and where there can be trust. I think there's a great benefit both to communities and to wildlife conservation writ large. A lot of work, I would say, is that eyes and ears of the community to alert protected area authorities and police to the incursion of outsiders who are poaching. And I think that's a very critical part of some of the successes that we've achieved. Here in Nepal, they had a year without any poaching of rhinos. And the rhinos, it's partially attributable to the really good relationship between the communities and the protected area authorities, and that early warning that communities can provide, and their community patrols are very important. And so I think that local aspect, that local security is very important to put into this whole chain of enforcement. And then looking back at this graphic, as Crawford mentioned, it's the transport. We've talked about a lot of communities, protected area authorities, but where's the private sector? The private sector is running couriers, they're running shipping container ships, they're airlines. And as Crawford said, they're beginning to get interested in what can they do. They're a pawn in this system in many ways. The unlawful transport of goods is going through their services, and they're interested in working with us. Certainly USAID, we have a program starting to look at this. The Royal Trust is looking at this. I know the State Department and others in the USG, we're really looking to see how can we engage the private sector to work with us to make a difference. And then unabashedly, I have one advertisement here. We're running a wildlife crime tech challenge. It just opened on Earth Day and it ends on June 30th. And we're looking for great ideas, and I thought I had to put in an advertisement since I'm talking to a group of scientists. So check out wildlifecrimetech.org, and we're looking for solutions, innovative solutions to address this whole aspect along the supply chain. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Mary. And so at this point, I'd like to invite the panelists up. And if you have questions, please come to the microphones.
This question is for Crawford. When you mentioned that you had a meeting, and I think there was an airline person there who was like, oh yeah, this entity is moving all of this illegal trade. What comes next? And the reason I ask is because I collect data on the illegal pet lemur trade in Madagascar, but I'm obligated to make sure that alleged pet lemur owners, their privacy is protected. So what happens next? Do you put them in touch with law enforcement? What can you do when you find out that information?
I think as a general rule, that is one of the biggest challenges in all of this when you're talking about effective law enforcement support. And as NGOs like ours, and many of those probably in the room as well, one of the biggest problems we have is when you get information, who do you trust to give it to? And who can you give it to that will deal with it effectively and quickly? And so there are lots of ways of trying to do that, but a lot of the time it's about building up those personal relationships. And in the case of this transport issue, I particularly mentioned that one example of the guy responsible for the cargo for Kenyan Airways. Obviously, we encourage that person to share that information locally with law enforcement, and also if they wish to give information, if they didn't trust people, felt uncomfortable about that we would try and help facilitate sharing of information where possible. We try and make sure that certainly my organization, I know a lot of others do the same thing. We put in place similar systems and mechanisms that law enforcement have themselves. So we do the checks and balances, we use the analytics that they use, we use the reporting formats they use, and so on, so that it's readily absorbed into their system, and we try to make sure that we aren't causing any problems for law enforcement too. It's a sensitive issue, and law enforcement don't really think that NGOs should be doing this, but sometimes we fill a gap where there's a vacuum in that way. I mean, there are other major institutions like Interpol and the World Customs Organization that have mechanisms, and we collaborate with them, as do many organizations, and provide information via them. But usually it's a case of a one-way, it's always, as we expect, a one-way street. We provide information, law enforcement takes it and deals with it, and they treat us as an intelligence source, an informant, if you like.
Would you like to add anything?
I'm just glad that Crawford didn't give out my phone number.
Next question, please.
Hi, my name is Sherman De Silva, and I'm a fellow at the Smithsonian, and I also am the founder and president of Trunks and Leaves, which is a nonprofit. And my question is for everyone. I was wondering where Asia fits into the picture. So we hear a lot about the African megafauna, and I particularly appreciated Craig Hoover's list of a lot of other species that are affected by trafficking. And in Asia, we have over 60% of the global human population. We have forests that are emptying out because you can retrieve as many as 200 to 400 snares per day out of them, which are killing animals indiscriminately. And these are not necessarily big organized gangs. And I was wondering what the strategy is for handling those situations.
Thanks for the question. I'll start. As I described in the presentation, and I'm certainly not in any way diminishing what we're seeing with regard to elephants and rhinos in particular. And if all of this attention and a call for an executive order from the president was based on the snake trade, we probably wouldn't be here. But it is important to expand this discussion to take into account the other fauna and flora that are really being negatively impacted by poaching and illegal trade. And again, some of that trade is incredibly high value when you talk about the Totoaba swim bladder trade, the caviar trade. These are all having significant impacts on wild populations. In some instances, it's simply a matter of at least initially getting protection for those species. So it's about getting CITES listings for sharks. It's about getting CITES listings for sturgeon species. It's about consideration under the Endangered Species Act and looking at other mechanisms for extending protection to those species. And then once you've extended protection, making sure that those countries responsible, either as suppliers or as transit countries or as consumers, are taking the necessary actions to extend those protections, to actually implement those protections and get those species on the right track.
I would say that it's just as big a problem in Asia. I think because of this focus on rhinos and elephants, a lot of things have been missed. As Craig put out the 8 species of pangolin, 4 of those are in Asia. The pet trade is also huge, and the live reef fish trade and all those other things. And so it's the same things that we're doing elsewhere in the world in terms of, one, working with communities, a lot of issues on habitat destruction as well. A lot of species that are being lost through that, but and some countries have really large internal wildlife trade, and so that's somewhat out of some of the aspects that we're talking about in terms of the international. But there are huge pet trades internally in many countries, and so they all have to be dealt with.
Thank you. Thank you for your remarks. My name is Margot Deckard. I'm with Next Gen Space, and this question is for Crawford. Crawford, you mentioned in the slide about the possible connection between terrorist groups and what their role in the illegal trade may be. And I was wondering if you might comment on what the Presidential Advisory Council is doing to move us towards getting a national intelligence estimate. We know that Secretary Clinton ordered a very brief overview report that you referenced, but we really need to go to that next step. It's important because without it, we really can't have a whole of government solution to this problem. It's important to get the Department of Defense involved in this problem, and in order to get them involved, you first have to have an NIE in order to task them. So I'm wondering if you could comment on if that's been addressed by the council, and if you think there's room for it to be addressed.
Yeah, I think, clearly there was an in-depth analysis undertaken by various US agencies looking at intelligence, if you like, with respect to Africa. And there was a public-facing document that obviously was very clearly had to be sanitized. So that report was not incredibly conclusive, but we presume that there was a much larger, more substantive document that is being used to influence how this goes forward, and some of the discussions that individuals I know, and myself included, have done with the intelligence services. They are very much aware of this issue. They're looking at it. Things are starting to move. I think that you're right that that issue is one that needs to be explored and looked at, and it's something that we will take up in the advisory council. But obviously I don't represent government. I'm not from an intelligence agency. I'm a sort of an outsider knocking on the door trying to say help wildlife. So maybe perhaps one of my colleagues from government might have something to mention. Craig, on that.
No, actually, I think it's the role of the NGOs, because the government officials can't really comment on it, or if they have a role in it. And usually in NIE, you want it to be done somewhat quietly, but in this case, where there's an intersection between illegitimate business and legitimate business, and undoubtedly legitimate businessmen are profiting from this, it needs to be done very loudly, because I think as a light is shown on them, they will begin to step away from participating in this trade. And that might be a much more palatable diplomatic solution than actually bringing those gentlemen to light on an international scene.
Well,
so please,
let me take it up with the advisory council, but also there are many things happening, and the DoD are involved in Africa with supporting in many ways. As sort of civilians, we can't know everything that's going on, but we hear about certain things. And I would say, Stephanie, thank you for the comment. We'll definitely pursue it with the advisory council, and we'll be in touch, okay, on the next one.
Thank you.
But Craig, do you want to comment, or is that?
Well, I would just comment that, of course, DoD is part of the task force. DoD is engaged. We are working with DoD in a number of different ways. Could that be greater? Perhaps it could be greater, but I don't think it is correct to say that there's not engagement and there's not involvement. I think that is in fact the case.
Thank you. No, Craig, thank you for qualifying my remarks. There is engagement. I just think to get it part of their mission requirement, and because we're about to go into a presidential cycle to get carry over to the next administration, it's important to put those things in place.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Roberto.
Hi, Corbin Heyer from Energy and Environment Publishing. I wanted to follow up on the near total ban on ivory that's been referred to by a number of speakers. So that was rolled out as a part of the strategy for combating wildlife trafficking over a year ago, but that's been sitting at OIRA under review and hasn't been publicly released, if I'm not mistaken. I'm wondering sort of, if there's what's the reason for the delay, if it's going to be released soon, and that would probably be a question for Craig. And for the rest of the panel, does the delay harm efforts to deal with the problem of poaching elephants?
That probably is a question for me. So just to be clear, the national strategy laid out a series of administrative actions. And in fact, we took the first administrative action in conjunction with the launch of the national strategy, and that was to impose a complete ban on imports, regardless of the age of that ivory. We were, as a matter of policy, even though we've had a moratorium on imports in place since 1989, we were allowing, for example, antiques to continue to come in for commercial purposes. We closed the door on that at the day that the national strategy was announced. So that was step one. Step two was to revise our CITES regulations to address what we call our use after import provisions. And essentially what our regulations now say is that any specimen of an Appendix 1 listed species, which includes the African elephant, the Asian elephant, sea turtles, and a number of others, in order for you to sell an item derived from one of those species in the United States, you, the seller, had to demonstrate that that item came into the country prior to Appendix 1 listing, which for the African elephant was 1990, or you had to demonstrate that it came in with a CITES pre-convention certificate. So essentially, we shifted the burden onto the seller to say, prove that this item came into the country either at a time or through a mechanism by which commercial trade was allowed. So those were two very significant steps that we've already taken, are already being implemented. The last of those steps is to revise what's called the African elephant special rule under the Endangered Species Act. And we have a proposed rule that we have drafted. It is currently with OMB under review. We are working closely with them, and we hope to have that proposed rule published for public comment in the very near future. The emphasis of that proposed rule will really be about further regulation of the trade within the United States. Again, because we have that import ban in place, we have restrictions on export, so the emphasis, it will apply also to import and export, but the emphasis will be on sale within the United States.
Quick follow-up.
Yeah.
Very near future. Can you give us a stronger sense than that? And then also, well, yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, within the next eon. I'm hopeful that we will have it published within the next month or two.
And is there a reason for why is OMB involved as heavily?
Well, there's a lot of interest, obviously, in regulation of ivory trade. There are interests from all sides of the discussion, from the antiques industry, the musical instrument industry, appraisers, the conservation organizations. It's really a matter of working through what those interests are and deciding how we can best regulate ivory trade for the benefit of African elephants. And that's really the objective under the Endangered Species Act with special rules.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, I think we have another minute or two. Again, Roberto Delgado here. Thank you again, everyone on stage, for participating. My question is directed to Craig. My experience also is primarily in Southeast Asia, working in Sumatra and Borneo, mostly on primates. And can you describe a little more about Fish and Wildlife efforts to improve local capacity in terms of law enforcement? I like Mary's comments, or was pleased with Mary's comments about including communities in conservation efforts. I've worked with local communities, even sort of helped sort of develop local park rangers, but they are often very ill-equipped to deal when running into poachers, illegal loggers, and other criminals. And not just with respect to sort of capturing or seizing individuals, but also can you maybe speak to a little bit about the prosecution and sentencing processes that may be involved in these efforts?
Okay, so capacity building and following through on investigations. Okay.
Right.
So in terms of capacity building, it's certainly an area of emphasis for us. I think the greatest impact we're having with regard to capacity building in other countries is through our grants programs, through our Asian Elephant Fund, our African Elephant Fund, our Rhino Tiger Fund, our other species-specific funds and regional funds. And of course, we've been doing that for many, many years. But through our notices of funding availability, we've focused more on directing funding toward wildlife trafficking and capacity building efforts related to wildlife trafficking. So there's definitely an increase there, and there are a number of people who work on those grants funds here who can talk in more detail about what those specific efforts are. And then with regard to following through on enforcement and prosecution, we saw a number of examples of significant seizures taking place, and Crawford may want to comment on this as well. Every time I see a picture of 4 tons of ivory seized at the border, I immediately react with, well, there's a success and a failure. Because it's not it's a success that you've interdicted illegal wildlife trade, but it's a failure that you haven't followed through to find out who all is involved in that. And I think, for example, Operation Crash is a good example for us of the right way to do it, of intelligence-led policing, of looking at the entire network, of going after the big guys, and we need to do more of that. For example, through our special agent attachés, I think it's an opportunity to do more of that around the world by bringing that investigative expertise to other parts of the world, by teaching other countries how to, instead of getting the splash in the newspaper because of one big seizure, identify that illegal trade and then follow it through to its endpoint and really go after the kingpins.
And then let me just add on that. I mean, a lot of our programs look at that whole part of the supply chain. A lot of it is also working on the national legislation to make sure that the policies and laws can actually enable an effective prosecution and an effective deterrent for crime. And so a lot of it is our work is policy reform, but also training the forensic scientists, training the prosecutors. And one does not train judges, one allows them to be informed. And so, but working along that whole process so that you can have that effective prosecution at the end.
Great. Please thank our panelists.